You know, it's funny. People have been asking me questions for most of my life. What was John really like? Why did the Beatles break up? Which song am I proudest of? Was there ever going to be a reunion? Do I remember the first time we went to America? And I normally have an answer. Sometimes a good one. Sometimes I sort of wander around it for 10 minutes and eventually remember what the question was. That happens a bit more now. But somebody asked me something recently that stopped me. They said, if you had to think about the people who meant the most to you, who would come to mind? And I thought, oh, that's dangerous. Because once you start naming people, somebody is going to say, what about this person? What about that person? So I don't really like calling it a list. Love isn't a chart.
Right. Is it him or a very good double?
Well, that was the... Put someone at number one and tell someone else they've slipped to number 4 this week. But there are certain people who come into your life and somehow become part of you. Even when they're no longer sitting beside you, you still hear them. You know, you'll be walking somewhere and suddenly remember something they said 40 years ago. Or you pick up a guitar and play a chord and for a second you're 22 again. That happens to me quite a lot. I suppose when people look at my life, they see the big things. The Beatles, Wings, the concerts, the records, Abbey Road, Shea Stadium, all of that. But when I look back, strangely enough, I don't always remember the big things first. I remember cups of tea, waiting around, someone making a joke when we were all exhausted, driving through the countryside, sitting with a guitar when there wasn't anybody watching. Those are the things that seem to survive. So if you'll allow me, I'll tell you about 5 people.
Oh, if they disembowel you, ask for Victor. He's got the softest hands.
Not necessarily the 5 greatest people I ever knew, not a ranking, just 5 people who left something in me. And I think the first one should be George Martin. George was quite an extraordinary man. When we first came down to London, we didn't think of ourselves as these important historical figures. Of course not. We were lads. We had songs. We had confidence, probably a bit too much confidence actually, and we wanted somebody to listen. George listened. That sounds simple, but it wasn't. You have to remember, we weren't trained musicians in the classical sense. I couldn't sit there and write out an orchestral score. John couldn't.
Softest hands. Thank you. And mention my name, they won't cut your feet off.
George Harrison couldn't. We knew what we wanted to hear, though. That was the interesting bit. We'd say things like, can we make this bit sound enormous? Or, can that instrument sound like something nobody's heard before? And instead of George saying, don't be ridiculous, he'd normally give us that little look and say something like, well, let's see what we can do. I loved that. He had knowledge, but he didn't use knowledge to make you feel stupid. That's a rare quality. Some clever people want you to know how clever they are. George wasn't like that. He'd listen to the song, he'd make a suggestion, and suddenly you'd think, oh yeah, that's it. With Yesterday, for example, the idea of putting strings on it felt a little strange to me at first. We were a band, guitars, drums, rock and roll. I didn't want it to become too sweet, but George understood that. He didn't come charging in and take the song away from me. We worked through it, and that became part of how we learned. The Beatles taught George certain things, I think, and George taught us an enormous amount. It was a proper relationship. Years later, I realized he'd become something more than a producer.
Yeah? I've been waiting all morning in here for a beating, but the service is terrible.
To me, he was almost like another father. I lost my mum when I was young, and I think when you lose a parent early, certain older people who show you kindness have a bigger effect than they probably realize. George believed in us before there was much evidence that he should. That's quite a gift to give someone, just believing in them. And whenever I think of him now, I don't immediately think of all those famous records. I see him in the studio, calm listening, waiting for one of us to come up with another mad idea and somehow making the mad idea work. Now, the next person goes much further back. George Harrison. I knew George before anybody cared who we were. That is a lovely thing to be able to say about someone. When you become famous, you meet all sorts of people, and most of them meet you after the world has already told them who you are. But George knew me before that. He knew the Liverpool version. I knew the Liverpool version of him. We were kids. We liked guitars. That was enough. George was younger than me and John, and in the early days you could sort of feel that. John and I could be quite loud. We had opinions, lots of them. George often sat back a bit more, but then he'd say
have many times.
Skeleton goes into a bar, orders a beer and a mop.
something very dry, very funny, and you'd realise he'd been watching the whole thing. He had a fantastic sense of humour, very quiet sometimes. You'd almost miss the joke if you weren't listening. Musically, he kept growing. That's what I remember. People tend to look at the Beatles as if all four of us appeared fully formed. We didn't. We were developing constantly. George became a beautiful guitar player. He developed his own voice as a songwriter. And toward the later Beatles period, songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun showed everybody what he could do. But our relationship wasn't always easy. I think it's important to say that. People sometimes want the four Beatles to have lived like four perfect brothers who never argued. That would be nonsense. We argued, we annoyed one another. I could be bossy. I know that now. Actually, I probably knew it then too. I just didn't always admit it. When you're working intensely and you care about the result, you can become very sure your idea is the one everyone should be following. George had his own ideas, naturally, and as he grew, he wanted more room for them. There were tensions, but the funny thing about getting older is that you don't carry every argument with you. At least I don't. I can barely remember what some of them were about. What I remember is George, the person, the kid I knew, his laugh, his guitar,
The oceans have turned to blood. Best to stay on dry land.
sitting around together long before any of us imagined what was coming. Near the end of his life, that became especially important. When somebody you've known since you were young becomes ill, all the old nonsense disappears. You aren't thinking, oh, we disagreed in 1969. You're thinking, that's George, my friend. And you want more time. You always want more time. That's something nobody teaches you when you're young. You think life is just going to keep providing another afternoon, another Christmas, another chance to ring someone. It doesn't always, but George still pops up. I'll play something on guitar and think of him. Or I'll be talking about Liverpool and suddenly I can see all the places connected with those days. Memory is a strange little film projector. It doesn't ask permission. It just starts playing. Now Ringo, dear Ringo, the nice thing about talking about Ringo is that I can still ring him. That becomes increasingly precious. When you've lived a long time, there aren't many people left who remember the beginning. Ringo does, and I remember his beginning with us. He was exactly what we needed. Fantastic drummer. People sometimes talk about drummers as though the cleverest drummer is the one playing the most complicated thing. That's never been how I hear music. It's about the song. Ringo plays the song. He's always had this beautiful instinct for it. But I love him for much more than drumming. Ringo can make things lighter. That's one of his great gifts. There were plenty of moments in the Beatles when the atmosphere got heavy. We were under pressure. The fame was ridiculous. You'd walk outside and people were screaming. You'd go into a hotel and there were people screaming. You'd get into a car, go somewhere else, and discover a new group of people waiting there to scream. It sounds exciting, and it was. But it could also be exhausting. Ringo could break the tension. A look, a joke, something completely unexpected, and suddenly we were four lads laughing again. That was important. Still is. We speak, we catch up, and there is something wonderful about talking to someone who doesn't require the first 50 pages of the story. You can say, do you remember when? And he already does. He was there. People ask whether it feels strange that only the two of us are still here from the band. Of course it does. How could it not? There are moments when Ringo and I are together and you can almost feel the other two in the room, not in some spooky way, just memory. John would have said something. George would have given you that look. You know their reactions because you lived alongside them for years. So Ringo isn't simply my old drummer. He's one of my oldest friends. He carries part of my history and I carry part of his. That is a very special kind of friendship. Then there's John. Where do you start with John? People have spent more than half a century trying to explain John and me. Sometimes I think they make it much more complicated than it was, and sometimes they make it much simpler than it was. We were mates, we were writing partners, we were competitive, we were like brothers. We could make each other laugh, we could make each other furious, and we loved each other. That's probably the truth of it. I met John when we were teenagers. There he was with the Quarrymen. I remember being impressed by him. He had something. Confidence, danger perhaps, charisma. He was older than me and I thought he was cool. I also knew a few chords he didn't know, which helped. Very useful when you're trying to get into a band. Soon we were writing together. And that became our world. People sometimes picture songwriting as a very mystical business. Two tortured geniuses staring into the distance until a masterpiece appears. Usually it wasn't like that. It was work, fun work, but work. We'd sit opposite each other, guitars, notebooks. You'd have half a song. He'd have a line. I'd say something. He'd say, no, that's rubbish. I'd say, yours isn't much better. Then one of us would find something and suddenly the other one would go, yeah, that yeah was important. When John liked something, you knew. He wasn't very good at pretending. I loved writing with him because he made me better. And I think I did that for him too. If he brought in something brilliant, I'd think, right, I better come up with something. That competition was healthy for quite a long time. It kept us moving. And beneath all that was a connection people sometimes overlook. We had both lost our mothers young. You don't necessarily sit around discussing grief every afternoon. We didn't. But when someone knows that kind of loss, there is a silent understanding. We knew things about each other that didn't need explaining. Then everything became enormous. The band, the fame, the business, and eventually the breakup. That period hurt. There's no point pretending it didn't. We said things. People around us said things. Newspapers loved it. John versus Paul, Paul versus John. It became a story people could sell. But life is longer than an argument. Thankfully, before John died, things between us had become warmer again. We talked. We weren't working together every day, of course. We had our own lives. He had his family. I had mine. But that old connection was still there. And then he was gone. That's one of those sentences you can say very quickly, but you don't really finish living it. He was gone. I remember the shock. And after shock comes all the things you wish you'd said. That happens with grief. You imagine another conversation. You think, oh, I'll tell him that next time. Then there is no next time. Years later, I wrote here today. It was my way of having the conversation anyway, because one thing about John and me was that we didn't walk around saying, I love you, mate, every 5 minutes. Liverpool lads weren't really like that then. You'd show it in other ways. You'd write together, you'd turn up, you'd make each other laugh, you'd defend each other. But sometimes I think it would have been nice just to say it. So I say it now. And when I think of John, I try not to think first of the end. I think of the beginning. 2 boys, 2 guitars. No idea. Absolutely no idea what was going to happen. That's the John I like visiting in my head. And then there is Linda. I could probably talk all day about Linda. She changed my life in a way that is difficult to separate into neat little stories. When I met her, one of the things I liked was that she had her own life. She was a photographer. She had met musicians. She wasn't going to fall over because I was in the Beatles. That was refreshing. Very refreshing, actually. By that point, it could be difficult to know whether somebody was meeting you or meeting Paul McCartney. Linda met me. There's a difference. We got married in 1969, and soon after that, the Beatles were coming apart. That was one of the hardest periods of my life. People now know the breakup as this historic event. There are documentaries about it, books, arguments, theories. For me, it was my life falling to pieces. That had been my band since I was a kid. John, George, Ringo. Suddenly, it felt like the whole structure had disappeared, and I didn't quite know what came next. Linda helped me through that, not with some grand speech. That wasn't her way. We had the family. We went to Scotland. There were kids running around, animals, mud, normal things. And normal things can save you. I really believe that. When your head is full of lawyers and newspapers and business problems, feeding an animal can be very useful. The animal doesn't care about your record contract. The children don't care about the charts. Life keeps asking ordinary things of you. And Linda was very good at bringing me back to that. Then we started Wings. And yes, I asked her to be in the band. People had opinions. People always have opinions. Some of them were incredibly unkind. Linda wasn't a trained keyboard player when we began. She knew that. I knew that. But I wanted her there. I didn't want to go off for months and have this separate life away from my family. We were building something together. And she got better. She became part of the sound. More importantly, she had courage. It takes courage to walk onto a stage knowing some people in the audience have already decided they don't like you. She did it night after night. I admired her for that. But again, when I remember Linda, I don't usually remember the stage first. I remember home. She loved animals, photography, the countryside, the children. We became vegetarians together. She made our family life feel like the center of things rather than something squeezed between tours. That was a lesson I needed, because musicians can always find another reason to work, another album, another song, another rehearsal, another tour. But your children are only 7 once. Your wife only has that particular afternoon once. You understand that more clearly later. Then Linda became ill. Cancer. Even now, that word changes the temperature of a room. We did everything we could. You hope. You try, you carry on. And I think part of you keeps believing that because you've managed to survive all these extraordinary things in life, perhaps you can somehow negotiate with this one too. But life doesn't work like that. Linda died in 1998. She was 56, far too young. People ask how you recover from something like that. I don't know that you recover in the sense of returning to who you were. You continue. That's different. You carry the person forward. Linda is still in our family. She's in photographs. She's in the way the kids talk about certain things. She's in recipes. She's in memories. She's in some of the values we still care about. And occasionally she appears in my mind so clearly that for one little moment, the years between then and now disappear. That's memory again. Little project still working. So those are 5 people who come to mind. George Martin, George Harrison, Ringo, John, Linda. And when I say their names like that, what strikes me is that almost none of what matters most has anything to do with how many records we sold. George Martin gave me encouragement. George Harrison gave me a friendship that reached back to childhood. Ringo gave me laughter and an old friend who is still here. John gave me a creative partnership and a kind of brotherhood I could never replace. Linda gave me home. That's quite a lot for one life. I've been unbelievably lucky, I know that. I was a kid in Liverpool who liked rock and roll. I couldn't possibly have imagined any of this. Not the Beatles, not America, not writing songs people would still sing generations later, not being 84 and still talking about those same boys I knew when we hardly had anything. But perhaps that's what age does. When you're young, you collect ambitions. When you're old, you collect memories. And eventually you realize the memories that mean most are rarely the ones where everyone was applauding. They're the moments before the applause, after it, or completely away from it. Someone sitting beside you, someone making you laugh, someone believing in you, someone you loved. If I've learned anything after all these years, it's probably this. Tell people while they're here. Ring them. Go and see them. Have the cup of tea. Waste the afternoon. Don't always wait for some important occasion, because one day what looked like an ordinary afternoon may become one of the most precious memories you have. I've got records on the wall. Awards, photographs of things that still seem slightly unbelievable, and I'm grateful for all of them. But they don't talk back. People do. That's the important bit. And if the people are no longer here, the memories talk for them. Sometimes through a photograph, sometimes through a story, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, through a song.